So, hello, welcome to Environment Matters, a podcast by the Environment team at Burgess Salmon. I'm Mike Barlow, the head of the Environment team. So in today's podcast, we'll be focusing on decarbonisation and transition plans. That's a particularly hot topic in light of ongoing developments in both the EU and the UK. And this is another of our ESG topics, which follows up on our discussion of climate change and sustainability and supply chains, which we dealt with in episode 5 of season 1 of our podcasts. And in that, we explored expanding corporate sustainability reporting, disclosure and due diligence obligations. And I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague, Gabi Gershuny, who's an associate in our team.
Hi, Mike. It's great to be here.
Hi, Gabi. And I'm also really delighted to be joined by David Desforges as a guest for today's discussion. David is not only our first external speaker to join one of our podcasts, but he is also our first international speaker. David is an experienced environmental counsel who practices in France as a solo practitioner. And in his capacity as of counsel for independent Paris-based law firm Almain Avocats. He has over 30 years of experience in environmental law, and his practice spans the traditional sectors of environmental law, as well as issues relating to climate change, circular economy requirements, and ESG. David, I'm really pleased you're joining us.
Thank you very much, Mike, for this very nice introduction, and thank you to both of you for inviting me to join. My pleasure.
Well, welcome. So many will be closely watching developments in the omnibus proposals in the EU, which are likely to affect transition plan requirements under the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And we're lucky to have David with us here to share his insight on those evolving requirements at the EU level, as well as the transposition international law in France. We're also going to touch on the position in the UK, where just 2 days ago, at the time of recording, we had the long-awaited launch of a consultation on transition plan requirements. So, as well as the complexities for companies as they navigate this divergence between different jurisdictions and uncertainty in a shifting landscape. So, Gabi, before we dive into our discussion with David, you'll probably know that I always like to start these podcasts by making sure we get our definitions right. Could you explain what we mean when we talk about decarbonisation and transition plans?
Sure, thanks, Mike. So there's a patchwork of mandatory legal regimes as well as voluntary frameworks and standards which introduce requirements or guidance for companies to prepare plans or reports that set out in broad terms their strategy for adapting their business to transition to a low carbon economy. The requirements or recommendations for the contents of those plans or reports vary across different regimes and frameworks. So when we talk about climate transition plans, key features include an assessment of climate-related risks and opportunities, metrics and targets which might be aligned with international and national climate targets. So the 1.5 degree goal in the Paris Agreement, or in the UK, the net zero target by 2050 in the Climate Change Act 2008. Also, governance processes for assessing risks and opportunities and for monitoring progress towards targets, as well as implementation and engagement strategy.
No, that's great. Really helpful explanation. And why are these plans important now, and why should companies be thinking about producing them?
Well, first and foremost, certain companies may be legally required to produce plans or reports, usually if they meet certain thresholds relating to their size and annual turnover. So, for example, the CSDDD, Mike, that you mentioned, the law as it currently stands requires in-scope companies to adopt and put into effect a transition plan for climate change mitigation. As you alluded to, Mike, as part of the European Commission's first omnibus package, there are proposals to amend this requirement, so to replace the obligation to put the plan into effect with a clarification that the plan includes outlining implementing actions planned and taken, and also to postpone that obligation to adopt transition transition plans by 2 years, and we'll await further developments on that as the process progresses. But beyond the CSDDD, there are various other EU regimes which impose requirements on companies to produce decarbonisation or climate neutrality plans. And hopefully we can explore some of those regimes further with David. But even if companies are not subject to mandatory requirements, there are lots of reasons why many companies are already choosing to produce a climate transition plan using voluntary reporting standards or guidance, such as the Transition Plan Task Force disclosure framework or the recommendations of the Task Force on climate-related financial disclosures, both now the responsibility of the IFRS Foundation. And it's just worth noting that the IFRS Foundation just recently published new guidance on what to disclose about a company's plan when reporting under the IFRS S2 standard or climate-related disclosures. So the recent UK consultation on transition plan requirements actually really helpfully sets out the benefits of transition planning for companies in a very clear way. So these include supporting firm level emission reductions, increasing competitiveness and reducing the cost of debt. And it highlights the importance of the process of preparing a plan to embedding action throughout a company's operation and also in its wider value chain. And also that doing that at a strategic level helps companies to manage the risks and also seize the opportunities of the transition to net zero.
Thanks, Gabi. So two reasons really. Then one is for regulatory compliance, and the other is as sort of part of good governance. Just taking the first of those, David, what are the key overarching pieces of legislation, the sort of compliance requirements in the EU which require transition decarbonisation plans?
Well, thanks, Mike. Actually, as you know, energy transition and decarbonization are nothing new in Europe. This involves a move which started probably more than 15, if not 20 years ago. It combines legislation with macroeconomic objectives at the level of the member states with legislation with microeconomic impacts at the level of the companies, large ones and SMEs as well. To give you a meaningful sample, I can highlight like 5 or 6 of them, which, as you will see, echoes Gabi's comments just a few minutes ago about this patchwork of legislation we're dealing with nowadays. The first one is probably regulation 2021-11 and 19, also known as the European Climate Law. It's not the first one, but that one sets a binding objective of net zero greenhouse gases emissions by 2050. It requires the EU and the member states to adopt national climate strategies and policies aligned with climate neutrality. It actually forms the backbone of for sector-specific and corporate decarbonization requirements, as well as the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which Gabi touched on. We also have the almost now infamous Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD, which requires companies to disclose transition plans aligned with limiting global warming to 1.5 Celsius, as well as climate-related risks and opportunities. This applies to large companies and to listed SMEs. It's implemented via the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, the ESRS, and especially ESRS E1, which mandates disclosure of decarbonization targets and plans for in-scope actors. As you well know also, climate change is also an area where vocabulary matters. Indeed, it may not be easy to define what is sustainable and what is not. And this is where the taxonomy regulation comes into play. It's a 2020 regulation, which establishes guidance for what qualifies as, unquote, sustainable economic activity, unquote, a notion that will open doors to financing. Hence, companies must report alignment of activities with such taxonomy and display how they contribute to climate change mitigation and how they commit, for example, to do no significant harm or other environmental objectives, such as preservation of biodiversity, which has also become key. This is all very industry oriented. But rest assured that the finance industry is not left aside in this process. The Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, the SFDR, applies to the financial market and financial advisors. Then again, it requires the disclosure of how sustainability risks are integrated into investment decisions and the alignment of portfolios with climate goals, including transition strategies. A financial product may therefore not be marketed as sustainable if not accompanied by decarbonization objectives and implementation roadmaps. Of course, in all this process, the EU ETS regime, which is well known to practitioners, is also a part of this overall decarbonization scheme. It covers the power industry, the industry itself, and the aviation sector. It requires companies to reduce emissions and increasingly so to purchase allowances as their allocation of free allowances will now gradually diminish. So maintaining free allocation of allowances will be conditional, again, on submitting decarbonization plans after 2026 for companies within the scope of the EU ETS regime. Last but not least, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the CBAM, will require also, as from 2026, although this has been postponed, will require importers to report emissions embedded into imported goods and to submit certificates offsetting the carbon content of these imported goods. It should therefore encourage foreign producers and importers to develop decarbonization strategies also to secure their imports into the EU.
Thanks, David. That's really helpful. There's obviously quite a patchwork of different bits of legislation which are all relevant to this topic. Are there any key sort of commonalities or differences that we can pick out between the bits of legislation?
Well, absolutely, Mike, and actually more commonalities than differences. Basically, these pieces of legislation have all several features in common, regardless of the sector, regardless of the activity, or regardless of the economic level we're dealing with. They somehow all require auditing and taking a photograph of an existing situation, which alone may be a challenge, as one's carbon footprint is not an easy thing to measure, but also a source of opportunities for companies to reconsider their policies, as noted earlier by Gabi. They all require companies to establish objectives or targets, to devise a plan or strategy as to how to get there, with each and every time intermediate milestones to reach. In all cases, economic actors are required to substantiate their undertakings via verifiable and indeed verified metrics. Reporting actually becomes a watchword in this whole endeavor. Member states report to the EU Commission, companies report to the competent domestic authorities, companies also report to their shareholders, companies inform their clients and stakeholders. Although all these transition and decarbonization plans involve a great deal of complexity, they have one feature in common, and that feature is that the whole system and the whole process is ultra transparent. Transparency is key here.
Yeah, no, that's really, really helpful way of thinking about it and simplifying it down to the bare bones. So while we've got you here, it would be great to know how these sort of wider principles and EU legislation are implemented in France, obviously where you're based. Are there any other key pieces of sort of French legislation on the same topic?
Oh, yeah, there are lots of them. And actually, I will focus on the mandatory ones because otherwise, dealing with the voluntary schemes would probably be too long. But as you may expect, like many other member states, France displays a mix of such measures. The mandatory measures stemming from the EU requirements are transposed into a variety of codes. The Energy Code, the Environmental Code, the Urban Planning Code, the Monetary and Financial Code, the Commerce Code, etc., etc. It forms actually a compact set of provisions which are in practice not always easy to locate and decipher, as their incorporation into existing codes leads them to losing their EU pedigree, if I may say, in the process. So when I'm required to decipher where does the CSRD directive, for example, is transposed, you have to pick into several codes to determine exactly what's been adopted here. But just to give you, again, a sample, these provisions include the Energy Climate Law of 2019, This one implies at the macroeconomic level a reduction of 40% of fossil fuel energy sources by 2030, the planning of energy policies, which have to be updated every 5 years, and the incorporation of climate considerations in all private and public decisions. This also implies that institutional investors, banks, insurance companies, and asset managers declare their exposure to transition and climate risks, describe their alignment with carbon neutrality objectives, and report on scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions which they finance. We also have a national low carbon strategy, which actually sets carbon budgets, as we say, on a sector by sector basis, and distinguishes between the industry, the transport, and the agriculture sectors. We have also an obligation for companies and administration to establish greenhouse gases reports, which we refer to as the bilan. The thresholds apply to these obligations. It applies to companies with headcounts in excess of 500 employees, to local administrative units, which we refer to as collectivités publiques, with headcounts in excess of 50,000 people, and public undertakings, which we refer to as établissements publics, with headcounts in excess of 250 persons. Since 2022, these have been reinforced with the obligation to include in such reports climate transition plans, quantified emission reduction objectives, and the taking into consideration now of scope 3 emissions. We also have a more recent climate and so-called resilience law of 2021, which introduced the obligation for listed companies to include a transition plan in the management report, which is an obligation now reframed with the transposition of CSRD, which took place in December 23 and was implementable as of January 24. Finally, in this list, which will remain non-exhaustive, we also have new obligations under the Monetary and Financial Code, which obliges asset managers to factor in risks related to climate change and energy transition strategies, therefore aligning with SFRD and reinforcing the extra financial reporting obligations which they already had to comply with.
That's really helpful, David. I think it's really interesting just to look at the requirements at the EU level and then just to drill down into one EU jurisdiction to see actually how that maps through. Before we get on to what the position is in the UK, perhaps you could sort of think about where we're going now. What are the likely developments in the EU and in France?
Well, as you probably have witnessed, it's more than likely it's actually developing as we speak. The omnibus is the latest development in the EU and in France, and in my opinion, is going to be sending shock waves, gradual ones, into the whole process. But it's not a game changer, but it certainly is a pause in this legislative development in the EU and in the member states. If you take France alone, we have a French law of April 30th of this year, which modifies the CSRD implementation schedule for certain companies. So it's been basically postponed to 2028 for large companies. So it will apply to the 2027 reports. It's been postponed to 2029 for listed SMEs. So will apply to the 2028 reports. And this applies to companies with a headcount of over 250 employees and a turnover of 50 million plus, or a positive balance sheet of 25 million plus. Very large companies having started to their reporting in 2025, i.e. in their 2024 reports, will not benefit from any postponement. Now, interestingly, there's a change of schedule, but there's no material change here. We should keep in mind, however, that the substance of the required reporting and the obligation to have such non-financial data audited by third parties, independent third parties, are not affected by these 2-year postponements. So for the time being, unless the contents of it all is reconsidered, it's just a postponement. It's just a pause, but it doesn't go any further at this point. But developments are ongoing as we speak.
So thanks for that, David. I suppose I take 2 key points away from all of that. First of all, that there's quite a breadth and complexity to the legislation across the EU, is the first point. and that creates difficulty for companies to navigate. But the second key point, I think, is that a lot of people are very hopeful about the omnibus and that was going to radically change things. But I think you're saying that, in fact, it's broadly the same. It's just been postponed for a little bit. So hopes of the demise may be exaggerated. But just turning now to the UK, Gabi, could you sort of talk us through where the UK fits into that wider patchwork?
Sure, thanks, Mike. So until now, there have been no specific requirements for companies to produce a climate transition plan in the UK. There are existing requirements under the UK listing rules for certain listed companies to make comply or explain disclosures in their annual reports about climate-related financial information based on the recommendations of the TCFD, which itself encourages companies to include essential details from their transition plans in those disclosures. There are also other climate and environmental reporting requirements, again set out in a patchwork of legislation and regulation. So this includes requirements for certain companies to publish information on their energy efficiency measures as part of the Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme, or ESOS, via an action plan. And also under the streamlined energy and carbon reporting regulations in their director's report, as well as non-financial reporting requirements under the Companies Act 2006. As you mentioned, Mike, at the start, just a couple of days ago now, the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero launched 3 consultations, and that included a consultation on implementation routes for transition plan requirements, as well as a consultation on the exposure drafts of the UK sustainability reporting standards based on the ISSB sustainability reporting standards, so IFRS S1 and S2. And a third consultation focused on providers of assurance over sustainability-related financial disclosures. So these consultations, it's made clear, constitute the first phase of the government's phased approach to modernising the UK's framework for corporate sustainability reporting. And this all follows the government's manifesto commitment to mandating UK regulated financial institutions, including banks, asset managers, pension funds, and insurers, and FTSE 100 companies to develop and implement credible transition plans that align with the 1.5-degree goal of the Paris Agreement. The government subsequently announced that it would consult on how best to take forward its transition plans policy, and in parallel, that it would consult on its proposal to adopt the ISSB standards domestically as the UK SRS, and to mandate reporting against the UK SRS for economically significant companies. And UK SRS would include requirements for companies to disclose information about transition plans if they have one. So the transition plan requirement consultation seeks views on all of the key aspects, really, of the government's manifesto commitment, including on designing a transition plan, disclosing the plan, having a plan aligned with the UK's net zero by 2050 target, and also implementing a plan. So it outlines options that the government's considering on how best to take forward future transition plan requirements. The 2 main options are first, requiring entities to explain why they have not disclosed a transition plan or related information, and second, mandating development and disclosure of a plan. The government also recognises, though, that neither of those options would create an express legal obligation for entities to take future action consistent with those disclosures. And so it's also seeking views on mandatory transition plan implementation, which is really interesting. Although it does note that option would take additional time to design and implement, and that the government would have to work closely with industry to ensure that the requirements are proportionate. Interestingly, the consultation also seeks views on whether and how climate resilience and nature could be incorporated over time to ensure a holistic approach to transition planning, with potential future nature requirements to be developed over a longer time horizon if they're taken forward at all. And that, of course, all builds on the work of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. So at this stage, all options are being considered, and the government's clarified that some might be taken forward in conjunction with others. The consultation closes on the 17th of September, and the government has said that it will consult again on the detail of any future requirements. So there's still some way to go. It also makes clear that it will be considering its approach alongside the FCA's, or the Financial Conduct Authority's, consultation on implementing the UK SRS for listed companies, and also alongside the government's wider ambition to simplify the UK's corporate and non-financial reporting framework, which it plans to consult on separately at a future date. Just in terms of, we've obviously had some really interesting insights from David on the EU and the French perspective. In terms of the interaction between the UK and the international landscape, the government has reiterated its emphasis on ensuring international interoperability of UK requirements and also on maintaining UK attractiveness as a listing destination. So it'll be interesting to see how the developments at the EU level in the omnibus proposals, as we've discussed, will affect the UK as this moves forward. So overall, lots more detail to come. But for now, I think a really positive signal that the government is pushing forward this agenda.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Gabi. As you say, this is clearly an area where we can expect lots of change, both at the international and domestic level. And I think that leads to the sort of concluding point that it's really important for companies and especially multinationals to understand how the evolving regulatory requirements in the different jurisdictions operate and how they might affect them, and how to navigate those diverging requirements to ensure their plans are legally compliant, robust and credible. So that's all we have time for today. Special thanks to David for joining us, for sharing your valuable insights on transition plan requirements in the EU and France, and also to Gabi.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike.
So thank you for listening to Environment Matters. We hope you enjoyed this episode on transition plans, looking at the requirements in the EU, in France and in the UK. If you'd like to know more about our environment or energy teams and how our experts can work with you, you can contact me or the rest of the team via our website.